Hello and welcome back on my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Nurul and it's time for another monthly reading wrap-up. In the month of June, I read a total of 8 books. And unfortunately, it wasn't that great of a reading month because a fair few of the books I read were 1 to 2 star ratings. Fortunately though, I did end the month on a more positive note by reading 2 books to which I gave 4-star ratings. So first, I read The Snail on the Slope by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky, 2 Russian authors. And I'd already read Roadside Picnic by them, which I had enjoyed. I mean, I only gave it 3 stars, but still found it, fairly good. And I knew they wrote weird fiction, weird science fiction, and this is the latest one that was published in the Science Fiction Masterworks edition. So, I was intrigued because it's about a weird forest and an administration that is set up to study that forest, and you go on from there. I didn't make a review for this because I didn't think it was necessary, nor really doable, because it's hard to talk about this book. You don't really understand what's going on. Like, it's the kind of weird that's just maybe a bit too weird, a bit too opaque. So, I gave it 2 stars. There's Kafkaesque stuff going on in there with the administration. I mean, that's pretty obvious when you read it. And there's that weird forest with weird things happening in there, and 2 characters with chapters that alternate between them. One character in the administration who wants to leave the administration and can never seem to do so, and one character who is stuck in the forest and wants to get out of the forest and can never seem to do so. So they're running around in circles. There's an afterword by one of the Strugatsky brothers explaining how this book came about and what it actually is about. And so you do get an explanation, but I'm like, dudes, if you need to write an afterword to actually get the point of the novel, that's a wee bit of a problem in my opinion. Apparently they thought this was their greatest literary achievement, and good for them. Maybe it's a bad translation, I don't know. It was just a bit too weird, too nonsensical and absurd. Though I will say this, I did like the weird forest thing. It reminded me of something like The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, or obviously something like the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. So at the same time I read that, I also read this, Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. This was a tremendous disappointment. Several reasons. I gave this 2 stars, and in fact, I DNF'd this book, for which I was both sad and proud of myself because it's something I've always had a hard time doing, and by that I mean I've only DNF'd 2 books in my entire life, so I'm like a perfectionist, I'm a completionist, I have to finish things I start. But no, I was like, look, you're hurting yourself reading this, you're putting yourself into a ridiculous state of annoyance and anger. Stop. So I did. I quit 2/3 of the way in. So I think since I read, more than half, I can still comment on this book. It is a popular science book about sleep and dreaming. Why do we sleep? What's the biological functions of sleep? What happens if you have sleep deprivation, if you have insomnia? What do dreams do? Do they have a function for mental health? Things like that. And I think the last part of the book was supposed to be about public policies surrounding sleep. All things which are interesting. And I will say this, I'm sad and disappointed because the core message of this book is a very important and valuable one. That message is that we should value sleep. Sleep is essential to good health, and unfortunately, in the developed world, we aren't prioritizing sleep like we are nutrition and exercise. I 100% agree with that, but the way the author went about spreading that message is ridiculously over the top and too alarmist, in my opinion. He doesn't act like a scientist trying to put his points across in a calm, collected, objective fashion. He acts like a priest proselytizing for the Church of Sleep. And I hate that. You take that tone with me, mate, I'm gonna get pissed. And he exaggerates so many things. So for those of you who have seen the movie Mean Girls, there's that one scene where you've got the coach giving a sex ed class to students, and basically what it boils down to is saying, if you have sex, you'll get an STD and die. If you have sex, you'll get pregnant and die. This book was basically, if you miss so much as an hour of sleep of night, you will die in horrible suffering. I'm exaggerating only a bit, honestly, because that's the overall tone of that book. If you have insomnia, do not read this book. In fact, it's ridiculous the amount of reviews I saw written by people suffering from insomnia saying this book freaking terrified them and made their insomnia 1,000 times worse. So if you have insomnia, go see a doctor. Do not read this book. It will terrify you. You're gonna get cancer, you're gonna get diabetes, you're gonna get heart disease, you're gonna be fat and ugly and depressed and miserable, and you will die at 20 years old. Another major problem, besides the tone, is that he actually lies about things. First off, there's no bibliography in this book. There is no citation section, which I'm sorry is inexcusable for a book about science. That's one thing. For another, he makes ridiculously tall and wild claims. He cites 400% increases in things and 200% decreases in things. That doesn't even make sense. And I'm like, you're a PhD mate. This is unacceptable. How did this get through proofreading? How did this get published? That kind of blows my mind. Now, there are a few footnotes with citations to research papers for like the reasonable claims, stuff which, by the way, I've already read about because I have researched sleep, because as someone suffering from mental illness, sleep is very important, so I've had to do a crap ton of research on how to have good sleep hygiene, which I encourage everyone to do, and which this book should have been doing, but it didn't really because it spent all its time just freaking you the hell out. So you do have solid bits of science in there, but then he comes out with these wild claims. He puts forward his own theories for things, or no, his hypotheses. He can't prove any of that. So don't take it at face value. Please read this with a critical mind. And finally, I will say this, and I will link this in the description box. I actually read a blog post by someone who does statistics and research for fun, and actually went through the first chapter of this book, and he annihilates it. He says it rests on basically close to nothing. He lies outright about things. I mean, that's egregious. So yeah, if you do read this book, please read it with a truckload of salt. The core message, like I said, is valid, but saying that sleep is more important than everything else is ridiculous. It is part of the fundamental pillars of good health with exercise, diet, and also reduction of stress, which he doesn't even mention. And okay, on a more personal note, the way he talks about mental illness is incredibly freaking condescending. Now, it's not unique to his branch of medicine, mind you, because you'll have people saying, oh, just eat different, oh, just exercise more, you'll feel better. I'm sorry, but go screw yourself. I'm sick and tired of PhD heads PhD-splaining, yes, I'm gonna go with that word, my suffering to me, alright? As someone who suffers and has suffered from mental illness for years, I have taken the time to research things. It's not perfect, of course, but this guy just coming in saying, this is what causes your mental illness, just sleep some more. Guess what? When people are mentally ill or suffer from other types of illnesses, we sleep too much. It's all fine and nice to talk about lack of sleep, but what about sleeping too much? He will prescribe you exactly 8 hours of sleep at night, while actually check this out. Every sleep research association will tell you that the optimal amount of sleep for an adult is between 7 and 9 hours. So there's some variability there. And for some people, it's just a bit less, and for some people, it's a bit more. So it doesn't take any of that into account. No, I just cannot in good conscience recommend this book. It's just not up to par to what I would expect from even, yes, a pop science book. Sorry. So, massive disappointment, massive fail, but I am proud of myself for actually managing to DNF this. And continuing the series of disappointing reads of the past month, I read La Maison de Becker. Now, I did a review for this book, if you want to check it out though. It's a review in French because this is a French language book. But to keep it brief, this was a hybrid between a novel and a memoir about this author's experience in a brothel in Berlin, where she worked for 2 years. And it talks about her experience as a sex worker, her relationships with men, her relationships with other women, with her own femininity, with the femalehood, etc. I thought it displayed huge amounts of navel-gazing. It made gross generalizations about what it means to be a woman, what it even means to be a sex worker. It also talks about the experience from a very privileged position, let's be real here. It doesn't quite make the apology of prostitution. It does talk about its negative aspects, but it does glamorize it. I think it romanticizes prostitution a lot. And I felt it was more a projection of her own fancies about prostitution than anything else. Something clearly nurtured by her reading about like Parisian brothel life in the 19th century and things like that. So yes, very disappointing, especially since I really enjoyed her 2 previous novels. I also didn't like what she had to say about women and heterosexual relationships, stuff I just do not agree with. So yeah, I will not be reading anything else by this author. Then I took a graphic fiction break. I continued on with Why the Last Man, with volumes 3 and 4, which are put together in this particular edition. I switched to those because I figured it's actually cheaper that way. So I'll now be sticking to these like double volume trade paperbacks. And it continues to be very compelling, engaging, enjoyable. I can't really say more than that because I don't want to spoil the story, but I'm excited to continue, and I already bought the follow-up trade paperback, which has volumes 5 and 6. And then I read volume 3 of Sex Criminals. Just I cannot get over the title of this series. And it's still funny and weird. I enjoyed it a bit less than volume 2 because it introduces a couple of new characters and I thought it was a bit more scattered overall. A bit less focused on the main characters. And so I went a bit less deeply into any one character or any one subject. But it's still funny and introduces like new powers that are weird and sex related. I was like, really? You went there, mates? Cool. So yeah, it's a wild ride. That's all I can say at this point. And as I was reading those graphic novels, I also read Grass by Sheri Tepper. Now I'm planning on doing a dual book review for Grass and Raising the Stones, which is the sequel, sort of, very loosely related, but technically they form part of a trilogy called the Arbeit trilogy. I have not read the third one because the third one isn't published in the Science Fiction Masterworks collection. I'm sure they'll like that. Besides, Rachel from the channel Karnadi read it and said it really wasn't as good as Grass and Raising the Stones, so I'm not going to bother hunting down a secondhand copy of it. It's called Sideshow, if you want to know. But this and Raising the Stones were good reads, thankfully. I gave 4 stars to both of them. If I had to pick, I would say Raising the Stones is slightly better. But so, Grass is about a planet of the same name, covered in lots of differently coloured grasses with a weird societal structure, and people go there because it might hold a cure for a planet-wide plague, and there's a religious organization in there, and creatures, and I'll get more into it in my review. But I really enjoyed this. I had read one other novel by Sheri Tepper before. I had read The Gate to Women's Country, which I loved. So yes, I'm really coming to appreciate Tepper's style and Tepper's writing, and in fact, I plan on reading something else by her in the future. And before I get to Raising the Stones, while I was reading that one, I also quickly read this, King Kong Théorie by Virginie Despentes, a French author and filmmaker. It is an essay about the author's opinions on feminism, or at least women's rights, women's place in society. I did not like it at all. I gave this 1 star. I could have DNF'd it, but it's so freaking short and it reads so quickly. I was like, just finish this. It was just not my cup of tea in the least. And yeah, she talks about prostitution, pornography, and rape specifically, and about gender. The chapter about gender was probably the only one which I agreed with in any way, shape, or form. The style of it is very crude and very vulgar, which is not my preference personally. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. I'm not doubting her qualities as a writer in general in French. I mean, I haven't read any of her fiction, so I can't judge on that. Anyway, This book, very crude, very vulgar. I don't like that at all, but fine. I can ignore that to some extent, but the content just did not agree with me at all either. She has some very egregious takes, in my opinion, about rape, prostitution, and pornography. She draws a lot of straw men, false arguments that some feminists hold about certain things. She quotes what she thinks is an American feminist, but she's an anti-feminist, so that was incredibly weird and misinformed on her part. I mean, things like, rape, or the risk of being raped is the price to pay to be a free woman in society. I'm like, that's a hot take. I'll leave it at that. And she throws in psychoanalytic theory in there. That's a very French thing. I just don't get it. I know it's a thing the French have. They're still very much embroiled in the whole psychoanalysis thing, a lot more than in the Anglo-Saxon world. I don't get it, but that's the way things are, I guess. So yeah, she has a lot of hot takes and puts words in, like, sex-critical feminists' mouths that they've never uttered, because I've actually read arguments on both sides of, like, the prostitution debate and the pornography debate. I know what the arguments are. I agree with a bit of both. I'm a bit in the middle. She clearly isn't informed in the actual debate, and that's what bothered me. Also, as a personal essay, there aren't any notes, any references, there's no academic analysis, nothing of the sort. It's just her own ramblings on this subject, which is alright, won't say any differently, but it wasn't for me. So I'll probably get rid of this fairly soon. And so finally, I rounded up the month with Raising the Stones by Sheri and Tepper. Like I said, I will be doing a review, so I mentioned that it is a loose sequel, technically, I guess, to Grasp, but I'm not really sure what the timeline is supposed to be. The story is very different. You got this planet called Hobbsland, and they have gods there that grow out of the ground, and there's also a culture on another planet called Vorstad, which is extremely violent and patriarchal, and there's a whole system of planets, and there's political intrigue, and the story goes on from there. And I really enjoyed it. I think the scope is a bit grander than what you have in Grass. It has it's not a space opera at all, but it has more of that vibe than Grass, because Grass takes place on Grass, but this takes place on several different planets, and you have planet hopping and things like that, and a lot of commentary about religion, which is also the case for Grass. But of course, I'll get into that in my review, which will be coming very shortly. But so, yeah, very happy I read those two books. And we'll be reading, like I said, something else by Tepper in the future at some point. I am looking at Gibbon's Decline and Fall, if you want to look that up for yourselves in the meantime. And that about wraps it up for the month of June. So a very mixed month. Actually, more of a negative month than a positive one overall, unfortunately, but sometimes it just turns out that way, doesn't it? Next month, I will be reading some fantasy. I'll finally be getting to Dead Astronauts by Jeff Vandermeer. I should have read this, I think, a few months ago. But yeah, I'll finally be reading it. In the meantime, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, morning, whatever. And I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.